The frozen wasteland of Prime stretched endlessly in all directions, its purple-tinged snow whipping through the air like angry spirits. Commander of the pack pressed her massive frame against the shelter wall, her silver fur matted with ice crystals. Her yellow eyes, usually bright with predatory intelligence, now held only the dull ache of loss. 3 days had passed since the avalanche took them. 3 days since she had last heard the playful yips and growls of her cubs echoing through their mountain den. The memory of their last morning together haunted her, little Kex chasing his sister through the snow, both of them tumbling over each other in their enthusiasm to explore the world beyond their cave. The species had evolved from pack hunters on this harsh world, developing thick fur, enhanced strength, and an unbreakable bond between family units. Standing nearly 8 feet tall when fully grown, they were apex predators who had eventually reached the stars. But all their advanced technology, all their spacecraft and energy weapons, meant nothing when nature itself turned against them. His mate sat motionless in the corner of their emergency shelter. His usually proud posture had crumpled into something barely recognizable. The massive warrior who had led countless successful hunts now stared at nothing, his breathing shallow and mechanical. Neither of them had eaten since the disaster. Food held no meaning when their world had ended. The rest of their pack moved like shadows around the shelter. 12 adult, each mourning in their own way. Some paced restlessly, others lay curled in tight balls, and a few stared out at the storm through the small viewport, as if willing the mountain to give back what it had taken. Their ship, sat buried under tons of snow just 50 meters away. The distress beacon had been broadcasting for days, but no rescue ships could penetrate the violent storms that had been raging across this continent for weeks. They were alone with their grief, trapped in a shelter barely large enough for their massive frames. Elder, the pack's spiritual leader, had tried several times to perform the ritual of letting go, the ancient ceremony that would allow them to accept their loss and move forward. Each time, the words died in his throat. How could they let go when there had been no bodies to honor? When hope, however foolish, still flickered in the darkest corners of their hearts? The communications array crackled with static, occasionally picking up fragments of distant transmissions. Trade ships, exploration vessels, military patrols, all going about their business in a galaxy that seemed utterly indifferent to their suffering. None were close enough to help, and none would be able to reach them until the storm systems cleared. Closed her eyes and tried to remember better times. The day Kex had taken his first steps, wobbling on unsteady legs before falling face first into his first successful hunt, when she had managed to catch a snow rabbit despite being only half-grown. The way they both would curl up against her at night, their small bodies warm and safe between their parents. The shelter's environmental systems hummed quietly, maintaining a temperature just warm enough to keep them alive. Outside, the wind howled with a sound that reminded them all too much of lost cubs calling for their parents. Every gust seemed to carry voices that weren't there, echoes of laughter that would never return. Finally moved, turning to look at his mate with eyes that held depths of pain she had never seen before. "I keep listening for them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even knowing they're gone, I keep thinking I hear them calling." Nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had been doing the same thing. Every sound the wind made, every creak of the shelter's frame, every distant rumble of shifting ice. Her mind interpreted them all as the voices of her cubs. It was torture, but it was also the only connection she had left to them. The pack's youngest adult approached cautiously. At barely 20 standard years old, she had never experienced loss like this. Her own cubs were still years away, but she had helped care for Kex and since they were born. "Commander," she said softly, "should we try the long-range scanner again? Maybe if we adjust the frequency." Shook her head. They had tried everything. Every scanning frequency, every sensor array, every piece of detection equipment on their ship. The mountain had swallowed her cubs completely, leaving no trace, no signal, nothing to follow. The avalanche had been massive, triggered by seismic activity deep in the planet's core. Billions of tons of snow and rock had rearranged the landscape in minutes. "There's nothing left to scan," said, her voice hollow. "The entire valley is gone, even if—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Even if they had somehow survived the initial impact, they were just cubs. They couldn't survive 3 days in that frozen wasteland without food or shelter. The storm outside seemed to be growing stronger. The shelter's walls vibrated with each gust of wind, and frost was beginning to form on the interior surfaces despite the heating systems. Their power cells would last another week at most, and then they would face a choice between freezing and venturing out into the storm to reach their ship. Elder stood slowly, his ancient joints protesting after hours of sitting in one position. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should discuss what comes next. The storm won't last forever, and when it clears—" No's voice cut through the air like a blade. "We don't discuss anything, we don't make plans, we don't move forward, not yet." The elder's ears flattened slightly, but he didn't back down. "The pack needs leadership, the cubs wouldn't want us to." "Don't," warning growls silenced everyone in the shelter. "Don't tell us what they would want. They're gone, they don't want anything anymore." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the quiet hum of life support systems. Each member of the pack dealt with their grief differently, but they all felt the same crushing weight. Kexan hadn't just been its cubs, they had belonged to the entire pack, as was the way. Their loss was a wound that would never fully heal. Hours passed. The storm continued its relentless assault on their shelter, and the pack remained trapped in their bubble of artificial warmth and recycled air. Some tried to sleep, others continued their restless packing. Found herself staring at a small toy that had belonged to a carved wooden figure of a starwolf that the cub had treasured. The communication array suddenly came to life with a sharp burst of static, loud enough to make everyone in the shelter look up. Quickly moved to the controls, adjusting frequencies and trying to isolate the signal. For a moment, they could hear something that might have been voices, but the interference was too strong to make out any words. "Probably another trade convoy passing through the outer system," she reported, her disappointment evident. "I'll keep monitoring, but I don't think they're close enough to help." That was when they heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, didn't match the familiar creaks and groans of their shelter. A rhythmic thumping, barely audible over the wind, but definitely there. The entire pack went silent, straining to listen. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from outside, somewhere near the shelter's main entrance. The sound was regular, deliberate, almost like someone knocking. But that was impossible. Nothing could survive out there, and certainly nothing would have reason to approach their shelter. The thumping stopped for a moment, then resumed with a different pattern. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 3 more. It was definitely intentional, definitely made by something intelligent. Was the first to move, his warrior instincts overriding his grief. He grabbed his energy rifle from the weapons rack and moved toward the entrance controls. "Everyone back," he ordered, his voice steady for the first time in days. "Could be scavengers. Pirates sometimes use storms as cover." The rest of the pack spread out, taking defensive positions despite the cramped quarters. Pulled her own weapon and moved to flank the entrance, while Elder and positioned themselves near the emergency exits. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Whatever was out there wasn't going away. Looked at and she nodded. They had to know what was happening. He initiated the door sequence, and the heavy portal began to slide open with a hiss of equalizing air pressure. The first thing that hit them was the cold. Even with their thick fur and the shelter's heating, the Arctic wind that rushed through the opening was like a physical blow. Snow swirled into the shelter, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Then they saw the figure. It was humanoid, but smaller than standing just inside the range of their exterior lights. It wore what looked like primitive cold-weather gear, thick furs and woven materials that seemed woefully inadequate for the storm raging around them. But what captured their attention wasn't the figure itself. It was what the figure was carrying. Cradled in the stranger's arms, bundled in makeshift blankets and barely visible through the snow, were 2 small forms. 2 familiar shapes that made his heart stop beating. "Kex," she whispered, the name barely audible over the wind. The figure stepped forward into the shelter's light, and they could finally see clearly. It was definitely alien to them, bipedal but much smaller than with pale skin barely visible beneath the layers of protective clothing. Its face was exposed, showing features unlike any species they had encountered before. But its eyes held an expression they recognized instantly. The look of a parent bringing lost children home. The stranger moved slowly, carefully, as if afraid of startling them. It spoke, but the words were in an unknown language, musical and strange. However, the tone was unmistakable, gentle, reassuring, protective. His weapon fell from nerveless fingers as she saw movement in the bundled forms. A small paw pushed free from the blankets, followed by a familiar whimper. Then another sound, weak but definitely alive. Her cubs, somehow impossibly her cubs were alive. The shelter erupted into controlled chaos as the pack surged forward, but held up a hand, stopping them. The stranger was still standing in the doorway, still holding their precious cargo, and sudden movements might be interpreted as threats. Easy said more to his pack than to the newcomer. Let them come in. The stranger seemed to understand, nodding slightly before stepping fully into the shelter. The door sealed behind them, cutting off the howling wind and sudden quiet that felt almost deafening after days of constant noise. In the warm light of the shelter, they could see the cubs more clearly. Both Kex and were alive, though obviously weakened by their ordeal. Their fur was matted and they were thinner than they should be, but they were breathing, moving, making soft sounds of recognition as they caught their parents' scent. The stranger carefully knelt and began unwrapping the makeshift blankets, revealing the full extent of what they had done. Both cubs were not only alive, but had been carefully tended to. Their injuries had been treated with what looked like plant-based medicines, and they had been kept warm and fed throughout their 3-day absence. Dropped to her knees beside the stranger, her hands hovering over her cubs, afraid to touch them in case they disappeared like a dream. "How?" she whispered, looking up at the alien face. "How is this possible?" The stranger met her eyes and smiled, a facial expression that seemed universal across species. They spoke again in their musical language, and while the pack couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear in the tone and body language. "I found them, I kept them safe, I brought them home." Elder was the first to recover his composure. As the pack's most experienced diplomat, he had dealt with first-contact situations before, though never under circumstances like these. He approached slowly, hands visible and empty, and began the universal greeting gesture used throughout the galaxy. The stranger responded with their own greeting, different in form but clearly meant to convey the same peaceful intentions. They began to speak, pointing to themselves and then to the cubs, obviously trying to explain what had happened. Through a combination of gestures, simple drawings in the frost on the shelter's floor, and careful demonstration, a story began to emerge. The stranger had been caught in the same storm system that trapped the pack, but from a different location. They had been traveling on foot, which seemed impossible given the harsh conditions, when they had heard sounds from beneath the snow. They had dug, for hours apparently, with nothing but primitive tools and their bare hands. They had found the cubs trapped in a small cave that had been partially collapsed but not completely buried by the avalanche. Kex had a broken leg and was suffering from exposure, but both were alive. The stranger had taken them to their own shelter, apparently some kind of natural cave system that they had modified for survival. For 3 days, they had cared for the cubs, feeding them, treating their injuries, keeping them warm. And then, when the storm had shown signs of weakening, they had set out to find the cubs' family. The implications were staggering. This unknown being had risked their own life to save 2 alien children they had never seen before. They had cared for them as if they were their own offspring, and then had made a dangerous journey through a howling blizzard to return them to their pack. Had been quietly working at the communications station, and she suddenly straightened with excitement. "Commander, I'm getting cleaner signals now. The storm is definitely weakening, and I think—" "Yes, there's a ship approaching our position. One of ours, the rescue party we called for." Looked up from where she was carefully examining her cubs, checking every inch of them for injuries. They were weak and frightened, but alive. More alive than she had dared to hope. The stranger was watching the reunion with obvious satisfaction, but they were also beginning to look around the shelter with what might have been curiosity or concern. They spoke again, pointing toward the sealed door and making gestures that suggested movement. "They want to leave," realized, "before the rescue ship arrives." Elder nodded thoughtfully. Many species prefer to avoid contact with galactic civilization. They may have their own reasons for staying hidden. Looked up sharply. After what this being had done, the idea of them simply disappearing into the storm seemed wrong. More than wrong, it seemed like a betrayal of the debt they owed. She stood slowly, still cradling against her chest, and approached the stranger. Up close, she could see details she had missed before. The alien's clothing wasn't as primitive as it had first appeared. It was simply made from different materials than they were used to. The stitching was precise, the design efficient and well thought out. This wasn't some savage who had stumbled across her cubs by accident. The stranger met her eyes again and saw something there that made her breath catch. Intelligence, yes, but more than that. Compassion, understanding, the look of someone who knew exactly what it meant to lose everything and find it again. She reached out slowly, offering her hand in the human gesture she had learned from galactic databases. The stranger looked at her extended hand for a moment, then reached out and took it. The contact sent a shock through both of them, not physical but emotional. For just a moment felt as if she could sense the stranger's thoughts, their feelings, warmth, relief, a deep satisfaction at seeing the cubs safely return to their family, and underneath it all, a loneliness that resonated with her own recent experience of loss. The stranger squeezed her hand gently, then released it and stepped back. They began gathering their makeshift medical supplies, preparing to leave. "Wait," said, though she knew they couldn't understand her words. "Please wait." She turned to, "How long until the rescue ship arrives?" "Maybe 20 minutes, Commander. They're having trouble with the sensor interference, but they've locked onto our beacon." 20 minutes, not much time, but perhaps enough for what she needed to do. Handed to and moved to the shelter's small but well-equipped laboratory station. Every exploration vessel carried basic scientific equipment, and she quickly began preparing a genetic sequencing sample from a few strands of her own fur. The stranger watched with obvious curiosity as she worked, but they didn't try to interfere. When she was finished, downloaded the genetic data onto a portable storage device, one of the most advanced pieces of technology their civilization possessed, capable of storing vast amounts of information in a crystalline matrix no larger than a fingernail. She approached the stranger again and offered them the device. They looked at it with confusion until pointed to herself, then to her cubs, then to the device. She was trying to convey that it contained information about their family, their pack, their people. The stranger understood. They took the device carefully, examining it with the reverence it deserved. They seemed to grasp that this was more than just a gift. It was a way for the pack to be found again should the need arise. In return, the stranger reached into their own clothing and something that made the entire pack gasp. It was a small piece of technology, but not like anything they had ever seen. It appeared to be made from some kind of organic material, shaped and grown rather than manufactured. It pulsed with a soft light that seemed to respond to the stranger's touch. They offered it to with the same careful reverence she had shown when giving them the data crystal. She took it, feeling a slight warmth in her palms as her hands made contact with the surface. The moment she touched it, images flooded her mind. Not her own memories, but someone else's. She saw the stranger's journey through the storm, felt their determination as they dug through tons of snow to reach her cubs. She experienced their careful attention as they treated Kex's broken leg, their patience as they coaxed to eat unfamiliar food. But more than that, she felt the emotions behind those actions. The stranger's immediate, unquestioning decision to help, driven by an instinct that transcended species boundaries. The way they had cared for her cubs not as alien creatures, but as children who needed protection. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it faded, understood something fundamental about the being standing before her. They weren't just intelligent, they were driven by the same basic values that govern society. Family, protection of the young, self-sacrifice for the greater good. "Human," the stranger said suddenly, pointing to themselves. It was the first word they had spoken that the universal translator could process. Human. So that was what they were called. Human. Filed the word away carefully, knowing that she would never forget it. The sound of atmospheric engines began to penetrate the shelter's walls, growing steadily louder. The rescue ship was almost here. The human gathered their remaining supplies and moved toward the door controls. They looked back at the pack one last time, their gaze lingering on the cubs who were now alert enough to watch the proceedings with curious eyes. Elder stepped forward and performed a formal bow, the gesture of deep respect and eternal gratitude. One by one, the rest of the pack followed suit, until even Kex and were making awkward attempts to mimic the movement from their parents' arms. The humans seemed to understand the significance of the gesture. They responded with their own bow, different in style, but clearly meant to convey the same respect and acknowledgement. Then the door opened, and they stepped back out into the storm. Moved to the viewport and watched as the human's figure disappeared into the swirling snow. For a moment, she could see the dim outline of their movement, and then they were gone, as if they had never existed at all. But they had existed, The cubs in her arms were proof of that. The strange device in her hands was proof of that. And somewhere in the vast galaxy, there was a species called humans who would risk everything to save children that weren't even their own. The rescue ship settled onto the snow outside with a deep rumble of landing thrusters. Soon the shelter would be full of medical personnel and rescue specialists, all focused on getting them safely back to civilization. There would be reports to file, questions to answer, debriefings with intelligence officials who would want to know every detail of their contact with an unknown species. But right now, in this moment, all that mattered was the warmth of her cubs against her chest, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, goodness existed in forms she had never imagined. Moved beside her at the viewport, still holding, who was finally alert enough to recognize her surroundings. "Do you think we'll see them again?" he asked quietly. Looked down at the strange device in her hands, still warm to the touch. "I think," she said slowly, "that we'll see each other exactly when we're supposed to. The galaxy is vast, but some connections transcend distance." The rescue team was already setting up equipment outside, preparing to bring the pack safely aboard their ship. Soon they would return to their home world, to the warmth and safety of civilization. But none of them would ever be quite the same. They had learned that kindness could exist anywhere, that courage came in forms they had never expected, and that sometimes the most important discoveries weren't new planets or technologies, but new ways of understanding what it meant to be alive in an infinite universe. As the rescue personnel finally entered the shelter, filling it with professional efficiency and controlled chaos, clutched her cubs closer and made a silent promise. Someday, somehow, she would find a way to repay the debt they owed. And if she ever encountered another species in need, she would remember the lesson she had learned on this frozen world. Sometimes, saving a life means more than just preserving existence. Sometimes, it means preserving hope itself. 6 months after the incident on Prime, stood in the observation deck of the research vessel Starwing, watching the swirling nebula of the Andromeda sector stretch across the viewport like spilled paint on black canvas. In her quarters, Kexan played with their new toys, sophisticated educational devices that would help them develop the skills they would need as future pack members. They had recovered completely from their ordeal, but the experience had changed them in subtle ways. Both cubs showed an unusual curiosity about other species, constantly asking questions about the different aliens they encountered in their travels. They had become fascinated by xenobiology, often spending hours studying the holographic displays in the ship's learning center. It was as if their brief contact with humanity had awakened something in their young minds, a recognition that the galaxy held wonders they had never imagined. The device the human had given her rested in a place of honor in her quarters, carefully mounted in a specially designed case. Scientists had studied it extensively, but their findings only deepened the mystery. The technology was unlike anything in their databases, apparently grown rather than manufactured, using principles that seemed to combine advanced quantum mechanics with some form of biological engineering. Most intriguingly, the device appeared to be some kind of cultural archive. When touched by different individuals, it revealed different images and sensations, memories of a civilization that valued cooperation, exploration, and above all, the protection of innocence. The scientists theorized that it was designed to create understanding between species, a tool for peaceful first contact. But interest in finding the humans again wasn't purely scientific. It was personal, driven by a debt of honor that could only be repaid through direct action. She had requested and received permission to lead a research expedition into unexplored regions of the galaxy, officially tasked with cataloging new worlds and making peaceful contact with previously unknown species. Unofficially, she was hunting for humans. The challenge was enormous. The galaxy contained billions of star systems, and the human who had saved her cubs had given no indication of where there might be. They could be anywhere, a nomadic species traveling between worlds, refugees from some distant conflict, or explorers from a civilization so advanced that they remained hidden by choice. Her pack had volunteered to join the mission without hesitation, served as her second in command, bringing his tactical expertise to the challenge of exploring potentially dangerous regions. Elder provided his diplomatic experience, essential for making contact with new species, and had proven remarkably gifted at analyzing alien technologies and communication patterns. The Starwing itself was one of the most advanced ships in the fleet, equipped with sensors capable of detecting technological signatures across multiple light years and translation matrices that could decipher new languages in real time. If there was a way to find the humans, they had the tools to do it. Their search had taken them through 17 star systems so far, each one a potential clue in a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every discovery. They had encountered 3 previously unknown species, established peaceful trade relationships with 2 minor civilizations, and dozens of new worlds suitable for future colonization. But they had found no trace of humans. "Commander's voice came through the ship's communication system, interrupting thoughts. "We're receiving something interesting from the long-range sensors. There's a technological signature in the next system that doesn't match any known species profiles." Moved quickly to the bridge, where her crew was already analyzing the incoming data. The sensor readings showed a small object in orbit around the system's 3rd planet, definitely artificial, but broadcasting signals unlike anything in their databases. "It's not a ship," reported, studying the tactical displays. "Too small, and it's not moving under its own power. Looks more like some kind of automated probe or monitoring station." Elder leaned over the communications panel, his experienced ears picking up subtle patterns in the signal. "The transmission frequency is unusual," he noted. "It's using a mathematical progression that suggests high intelligence, but the actual content is encrypted beyond our current capabilities." Felt a familiar stirring of excitement. After months of disappointment, this felt different. The probe's technology readings showed the same kind of organic-mechanical hybrid design they had seen in the human device, grown rather than built, shaped by principles that transcended traditional engineering. "Set course for the 3rd planet," she ordered, "and prepare the translation matrices. If this is what I think it is, we're going to need every tool we have." The journey to the inner system took 3 days, during which the probe's signals grew stronger and more complex. As they approached, their sensors revealed additional details that confirmed growing suspicions. The probe was definitely of human origin. Its energy signature matched the readings they had taken from the device on Prime. But more importantly, it wasn't alone. "Commander," announced excitedly, "I'm detecting multiple technological signatures on the planet's surface. Small settlements may be research stations, and the energy patterns, they're all human." Gripped the command chair's armrests tightly, trying to contain her emotions. After 6 months of searching, they had finally found them. The beings who had saved her cubs were down there, on a world that seemed as unremarkable as any of the thousands they had passed through. "Any signs of defensive systems?" asked, his tactical training taking precedence even in the excitement of discovery. "None that I can detect," replied. "In fact, the settlements appear to be completely peaceful. No military installations, no weapons platforms, just research facilities, agricultural areas, and what looks like a small spaceport." Elder was monitoring the communication channels, trying to establish contact. "They're definitely aware of our presence," he reported. "The probe's transmission patterns have changed, and I'm detecting what might be attempts at communication from the surface." "Can you establish a translation matrix?" "Working on it. The language structure is unlike anything we've encountered, but there are mathematical constants that suggest universal concepts. Give me a few minutes." Found herself thinking about the cubs, safely aboard their ship, but watching the proceedings with the same intense curiosity they had shown since their rescue. Kex had insisted on being present when they found the nice person who helped us, as he called the human in his simple understanding of what had happened. "Commander," Elder said suddenly, "I think I have something. The translation matrix is crude but functional. They're requesting permission to send up a shuttle to meet with us." "A shuttle?" Looked concerned. "That seems remarkably trusting for a first contact situation." Thought about the human who had walked through a blizzard to return her cubs, asking nothing in return but the knowledge that they were safe. Trust seemed to be a fundamental characteristic of their species. "Grant permission," she decided, "but maintain full sensor monitoring and prepare our own shuttle for launch if needed." The human shuttle that approached an hour later was unlike any spacecraft they had ever seen. It moved with an organic grace that suggested biological engineering, its hull seeming to shift and adapt to the stresses of atmospheric flight. But it was also clearly unarmed and posed no threat to their much larger vessel. As it docked with the Starwing shuttle bay, felt a nervousness she hadn't experienced since her first command mission. This wasn't just another diplomatic contact. This was deeply personal. These beings had saved her children's lives, and she had spent months searching for a way to properly express her gratitude. The shuttle's airlock cycled, and three figures emerged into the bay. They were definitely human, matching the basic physical description they had recorded on Prime, but was struck by how much individual variation existed within their species. One was tall and lean with dark skin, another was shorter and broader with pale features, and the third appeared to be somewhere between the other two in most respects. What united them was their body language, open, curious, cautiously friendly. They showed no fear at being aboard an alien vessel, but neither did they seem careless about the potential dangers. It was the attitude of explorers who had learned to balance optimism with prudence. Elder stepped forward to perform the formal greeting ritual, and was surprised when the lead human responded with a gesture that seemed designed to acknowledge the customs while introducing their own. The translation matrix was working, allowing for basic communication despite the obvious complexity of both languages. "Welcome aboard the Starwing," said, stepping forward to introduce herself. "I am Commander, and I believe one of your people once did my family a great service." The lead human's expression changed immediately, shifting from diplomatic curiosity to something much more personal. They spoke rapidly in their own language, then seemed to remember the translation requirements and repeated themselves more slowly. "You are the mother of the cubs that were saved on the frozen world," the human said, their translated words carrying an undertone of recognition and warmth. "Told us about your children. Is he correct that they survived and recovered?" So that was the name of their rescuer. Felt a piece of the puzzle click into place, making the human who had saved her cubs seem more real, more individual. "They did survive," she confirmed. "They are healthy and growing strong. We owe their lives to courage and compassion." The human smiled, an expression that the translation matrix correctly identified as indicating pleasure and satisfaction. "We'll be very happy to hear this. He has spoken of your cubs many times, wondering if he had done enough to help them." "Where is he?" asked. "I have carried a debt of honor for 6 months, and I wish to repay it properly." The humans exchanged glances and sensed some kind of internal communication passing between them. The lead human spoke again, their words careful and deliberate. "Is not on this world. He has returned to what you might call our home region, carrying out other missions for our people. But if you wish to meet with him again, this can be arranged." "Your people," Elder interjected. "Forgive our curiosity, but we have searched many systems looking for your species. Are you explorers, refugees, traders?" Again the humans exchanged glances, and this time their discussion was longer and more complex. When they turned back to the delegation, their expressions had become more serious. "Perhaps this conversation would be better continued in a more comfortable setting," the lead human suggested. "Would you accept an invitation to visit our research station? We have much to discuss, and the topics are complex." Looked at her senior officers, reading their opinions in the subtle body language that came from years of working together. Was cautious, but not opposed, was eager to learn more about human technology, and Elder was professionally curious about their diplomatic possibilities. "We would be honored to accept your invitation," replied. "But I must ask, would it be possible for my cubs to accompany us? They have expressed a strong desire to meet your people, and I believe would wish to see how well they have recovered." The human's smile returned, broader this time. "Of course, children are always welcome among our people. In fact, I think you will find that we have much in common when it comes to caring for the young." The journey to the planet's surface in the human shuttle was a revelation in itself. The craft's interior was designed for comfort rather than efficiency, with viewing ports that allowed passengers to see the landscape below and seating that seemed to adapt to the occupants' physical requirements. But more than the technology, was struck by the humans' obvious delight in sharing their world. The pilot pointed out geographical features, explained the planet's unique ecosystem, and asked careful questions about biology and culture. There was no sense of interrogation or hidden agenda, just genuine curiosity and a desire to understand their guests. The research station turned out to be much larger than their orbital sensors had indicated, built partially underground and integrated seamlessly with the natural landscape. It was clearly designed by beings who valued harmony between technology and nature, prioritizing sustainability over pure functionality. As their shuttle approached the landing area, could see humans working in gardens, children playing in carefully designed recreational areas, and what appeared to be members of other species moving freely among them. "You have other aliens here?" observed. "Partners," the lead human corrected gently. "We have found that the galaxy becomes much more interesting when different species work together. Our research here benefits from perspectives that no single race could provide." They landed in a facility that reminded of her own ship's hangar bay, but with design elements that spoke to different aesthetic sensibilities. Everything was functional, but also beautiful in a way that suggested art and engineering had developed together rather than separately. A group of humans was waiting to meet them, and among them saw several individuals she was certain belonged to other species entirely. The diversity was remarkable, beings of different sizes, skin colors, and even different numbers of limbs, all obviously comfortable working together. But it was the small figure standing slightly apart from the main group that caught her attention. A young human, probably equivalent to an adolescent in terms, whose excitement was barely contained as they watched the delegation emerge from the shuttle. "That is," their guide explained, nodding interest. "She has been studying the recordings made of his time with your cubs. She has many questions about child-rearing practices." Kexan had been unusually quiet during the journey, overwhelmed by the new experiences, but also remembering their previous encounter with humans. Now, seeing the obvious friendliness of their reception, they began to relax and show their natural curiosity. The young human called approached carefully, obviously remembering instructions about proper behavior around alien children. She spoke to the cubs in simple, carefully translated words, asking about their journey and their interests. Within minutes, the initial awkwardness had disappeared, and the three youngsters were engaged in the universal language of play, with showing them interesting plants and keks and demonstrating games they had learned. "Children adapt faster than adults," Elder observed with amusement. "Always," agreed one of the human adults. "It is one of the reasons we prioritize peaceful contact whenever possible. The young ones show us what is possible when fear does not interfere with understanding." The tour of the research station revealed the scope of human scientific endeavors. They were studying everything from planetary geology to interstellar communication patterns, but with an approach that emphasized long-term thinking and minimal environmental impact. Their technology was sophisticated, but it was also clearly designed to work in harmony with natural systems rather than dominating them. More interesting, too, was the evidence of previous contact with other species. She saw artwork from a dozen different civilizations, scientific equipment designed for beings with completely different physical requirements, and communication devices that could apparently translate dozens of languages simultaneously. "How long have your people been exploring the galaxy?" she asked during a break in their tour. Their guide considered the question carefully. "That depends on how you define exploration," they replied. "We have been traveling between stars for several centuries, but we have been studying and learning from other species for much longer. My people believe that wisdom comes from understanding many different perspectives." "And is he typical of your explorers?" The human paused, searching for the right words. "Represents our values very clearly, but his specific situation is somewhat unique. Perhaps that conversation would be better held with someone who has more authority to discuss such matters." They were led to a comfortable meeting room where an older human was waiting, along with representatives from two other species that didn't immediately recognize. The setup reminded her of a diplomatic conference, but the atmosphere was much more relaxed than formal negotiations usually provided. "Commander," the older human said, rising to greet them. "I am Dr. Sarah, director of this research facility. I understand you have been searching for our people for some time." "6 months," confirmed. "We owe a debt that can only be repaid through personal contact. In culture, saving someone's children creates obligations that transcend all other considerations." Doctor nodded thoughtfully. "We understand the importance of such debts, but before we discuss arranging a meeting with, there are some things you should know about our people and our current situation." She gestured to chairs that had been arranged in a circle, clearly designed to put all participants on equal footing. As they settled themselves, noticed that the room's design incorporated elements from multiple species, not a human space that accommodated others, but a truly multi-species environment. The individual you knew as is part of what we call the Pathfinder program, Doctor began. Our people discovered space travel later than many species, and when we finally reached the stars, we found a galaxy already divided into territories and alliances. Rather than compete for resources or attempt to establish our own empire, we chose a different path. We became mediators, added one of the alien representatives, whose translated words carried undertones of deep respect. Humans have a unique ability to understand and work with species that consider themselves incompatible. The Pathfinders are individuals who travel alone or in very small groups, making contact with new species and offering assistance without asking for anything in return. They carry no weapons, make no territorial claims, and avoid involvement in political disputes. Their only mission is to help where help is needed. Began to understand. Wasn't exploring when he found my cubs, he was on a mission. A mission to help the survivors of a mining accident on Prime, Doctor confirmed. There was a small research outpost that had been cut off by the storm systems, was attempting to reach them when he encountered your family's situation. Did he reach the other survivors? He did. All 17 members of the research team survived, thanks to supplies and shelter techniques that provided. Your cubs were not the only lives he saved during that storm. The implications hit like a physical blow. Hadn't just stumbled across her cubs by accident. He had been in the middle of a rescue mission when he diverted his efforts to help them. He had put other lives at risk to save her children. The debt we owe is even greater than I thought, she said quietly. From's perspective, there is no debt, Doctor replied gently. Pathfinders don't help others in order to create obligations. They help because that is what their training and their values require them to do. Elder leaned forward, his diplomatic instincts engaged. This Pathfinder program, is it an official function of your government? We don't have a government in the sense that most species understand it, one of the alien representatives explained. Human civilization is organized around voluntary cooperation and shared values rather than centralized authority. The Pathfinder program exists because individual humans choose to become Pathfinders, Doctor added. They receive training and support, but they are not soldiers or diplomats in any formal sense. They are simply people who have dedicated their lives to making the galaxy a better place. Had been quiet during the discussion, but now he spoke up with a question that revealed his tactical training. How do you coordinate such activities without central command? How do you prevent conflicts or ensure that your people don't interfere with each other's missions? Communication, Doctor said simply, and trust. Pathfinders maintain contact with facilities like this one, sharing information about their activities and requesting support when needed. But ultimately, each individual is trusted to make the right decisions based on the situation they encounter. It works, added the other alien representative, because humans have proven themselves over generations of contact. When a human Pathfinder arrives in a system, other species know that their intentions are peaceful and their assistance is genuine. Was beginning to see the scope of what humans had accomplished. Rather than building an empire or fighting for resources, they had made themselves indispensable as mediators, helpers, and peacekeepers. It was a form of influence that transcended traditional power structures. Where is now, she asked. Is it possible to arrange a meeting? Doctor smiled. Is currently in the Sigma Draconis system, helping to mediate a territorial dispute between two mining consortiums. But he could be contacted, and I believe he would be very interested in meeting with your family again. However, she continued, her expression becoming more serious, there is something you should know. Meeting with may lead to opportunities for greater cooperation between our peoples. Human leadership, such as it is, has been very interested in making formal contact with the government. For what purpose? Partnership. The Pathfinder program has identified several situations where assistance could make a significant difference. Your people's combat skills, technological expertise, and strong family structures make you ideal partners for certain types of missions. Elder's ears pricked up with interest. What kind of missions? Rescue operations in hostile environments, mediation of conflicts involving warrior species, protection of refugee populations. The galaxy contains many situations where good intentions are not enough, where the threat of force, properly applied, is the only thing that prevents greater violence. Felt a stirring of excitement. The idea of working alongside humans, of being able to repay her debt through useful service, appealed to her on multiple levels. "This would require approval from our government," she said carefully. "Of course, but if you are interested in exploring the possibilities, we could arrange for you to accompany on his current mission. It would give you a chance to see how Pathfinders operate, and it might provide valuable insights into whether our peoples could work effectively together." The meeting continued for several hours, covering topics ranging from human history to military capabilities to the specific challenges facing various regions of the galaxy. By the time they broke for the evening meal, felt as if she understood humans better than many species she had known for years. That night, as they stayed in comfortable quarters provided by their hosts, found herself thinking about the choice facing her. She could contact her superiors, report the location of human civilization, and let the diplomats take over the process of establishing formal relations. It would be the safe, proper approach. Or she could accept Doctor's invitation to accompany on his mission, learning firsthand how humans operated and potentially paving the way for the kind of partnership that could benefit both species. The cubs had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted by the excitement of meeting new beings and exploring an alien facility. But their dreams seemed peaceful, and knew they had been profoundly affected by the kindness shown to them by their human hosts. Approached her as she stood at the window, looking out at the alien landscape where humans and other species worked together in apparent harmony. "You're thinking about accepting their offer," he said. It wasn't a question. "The cubs are safe, our pack is strong, and we owe a debt that can't be repaid through normal diplomatic channels. It could be dangerous, unknown territory, unfamiliar challenges." "When has that ever stopped us before?" asked with a slight smile. Was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "When do we leave?" The journey to the Sigma Draconis system took 8 days aboard the human vessel Wanderer, and it gave unprecedented insight into how Pathfinders operated. The ship itself was a marvel of adaptive engineering, larger than the shuttle that had brought them to the research station, but still small enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention. Its hull could change configuration to mimic different types of vessels, and its internal spaces could be reconfigured for different species' comfort requirements. Was exactly as remembered him, though seeing him in his natural environment revealed aspects of his character she hadn't noticed during their brief encounter on Prime. He was quiet and thoughtful, spending much of his time studying reports from the disputed system they were approaching. But when he interacted with her cubs, his entire demeanor changed, becoming warm and playful in a way that transcended species boundaries. Kexan had bonded with him immediately, though their initial shyness gave way to the same fascination they had shown with all things human. They followed him around the ship when their studies permitted, asking endless questions about human culture and technology. Answered with patient thoroughness, clearly enjoying their curiosity. "They have grown much since I last saw them," he observed during one of their quiet conversations. "Not just physically, but in their understanding of the galaxy." "You changed them," replied. "Before Prime, they thought the universe was made up of and prey species. Now they understand that intelligence comes in many forms." Smiled, an expression she was learning to read with increasing accuracy. "Perhaps they changed me as well. Saving lives is part of what I do, but caring for children is something different. It reminded me why the work matters." The briefing materials on the Sigma Draconis situation painted a picture of escalating conflict that threatened to spill over into neighboring systems. 2 mining consortiums, one dominated by the aggressive species, the other by the more peaceful but stubborn Helios Republic, had discovered overlapping claims to a rich asteroid field. Both sides had legitimate legal arguments, but neither was willing to compromise. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the presence of a refugee fleet in the same system. Nearly 50,000 civilians from a recently destroyed world had taken shelter in the asteroid field, hopping to mine enough resources to fund resettlement efforts. They were caught between the 2 consortiums, unable to defend themselves, but unwilling to abandon their only hope of rebuilding their lives. "Traditional diplomatic solutions have failed," explained as they reviewed the tactical situation. The Galactic Council has no jurisdiction because the system is in disputed territory. The consortiums have reached the point where they're considering military action, which would be disastrous for the refugees. Studied the deployment charts with professional interest. They have brought serious firepower, he noted. 3 heavy cruisers and a full squadron of fighters. They're not planning to negotiate. The Helios Republic isn't much better, Elder added. Their diplomatic communications suggest they're prepared to use force if necessary to protect their claims. Looked at the refugee population statistics. Families, children, elderly civilians who had already lost everything once. What exactly can we accomplish that previous mediators couldn't? Hopefully, we can change the nature of the conversation, replied. Sometimes conflicts persist not because the solutions are impossible, but because the participants can't see past their immediate positions to understand their underlying interests. As they approached the Sigma Draconis system, the scale of the crisis became apparent. Long-range sensors showed 3 distinct fleets positioned around the asteroid field, each maintaining careful distances while obviously preparing for potential combat. The refugee ships were scattered throughout the field itself, trying to remain inconspicuous while continuing their mining operations. Incoming transmission, announced, who had insisted on joining the mission despite doctors' warnings about potential danger. It's from the flagship. They're demanding that we identify ourselves and state our business. Move to the communication station with calm efficiency. This is aboard the vessel Wanderer. We are here to offer mediation services to all parties involved in the current dispute. The response came quickly, in the harsh tones typical of military communications. This is Admiral of the Defense Force. We require no mediation. The asteroid field belongs to us by right of first discovery, and we will take possession of it within 72 standard hours. Admiral, replied calmly, I understand your position. However, I believe there may be solutions that would benefit all parties more than military action. Would you be willing to meet with representatives of all interested groups to discuss alternatives? There was a pause before the Admiral responded. Human mediator, you waste our time, but we will grant you one meeting out of respect for your species' reputation. You will come aboard our flagship in 6 hours. Come alone. Nodded to himself as if he had expected this response. Thank you, Admiral. I will be there. As soon as the communication ended, stood up from her position at the tactical station. You're not going alone. The Admiral was quite specific. The Admiral hasn't dealt with before, interrupted. In our culture, important negotiations require the presence of a full pack. It's a matter of honor and practical security. Looked uncertain. This could complicate matters, respect strength, but they also interpret displays of force as challenges. Then we need to make sure they understand the difference, said. You've spent months studying our culture. What does an honor guard represent? Thought for a moment. Protection of something valuable. The presence of an honor guard doesn't suggest threat. It suggests that whatever is being protected is worth defending. Exactly, and what we're protecting is the possibility of a peaceful solution. The next few hours were spent in careful preparation. Briefed them on customs and psychology, whilst team prepared their equipment and coordinated their approach. The Cubs would remain aboard the Wanderer with a small human crew, safely distant from any potential violence, but connected via communication links so they could observe the proceedings. The flagship was exactly what it expected, massive, heavily armed, and designed to intimidate. Their shuttle was guided into a docking bay that could have accommodated vessels 3 times their size, surrounded by fighter craft and weapons systems that tracked their movement with obvious intent. The reception committee consisted of 12 warriors, each standing over 9 feet tall and armed with weapons that could have leveled a building. Their scales gleamed under the harsh lighting of the bay, and their predatory eyes missed nothing as the delegation emerged from their shuttle. Admiral was recognizable immediately, not just from his rank insignia, but from the way the other deferred to his presence. He was larger than the others, with scars that spoke of countless battles and an aura of controlled violence that filled the space around him. Human, he rumbled in accented standard galactic. You bring guards to a diplomatic meeting. I bring witnesses, replied calmly, as is proper when discussing matters of honor between warrior peoples. It was perfectly phrased, acknowledging the warrior nature while positioning thee as peers rather than subordinates. Saw the slight shift in the admiral's posture that indicated respect, and knew that cultural studies had been accurate. Very well, follow, but your weapons remain here. They were escorted through corridors that showcased engineering at its most impressive. Everything was built for durability and function, but there was an aesthetic sensibility as well. Patterns in the metal work that suggested artistic traditions, lighting schemes that created atmosphere as well as visibility. The conference room was smaller than had expected, but she realized this was deliberate. Preferred intimate spaces for serious discussions, where body language and emotional undercurrents could be read accurately. A table had been arranged with seating for the human delegation, while the representatives remained standing in their traditional discussion formation. Before we begin, Admiral announced, you will explain why this conversation should continue. We have legal claim to the asteroid field. The Helios Republic has no standing to dispute this. The refugees are trespassers who must be removed. Military action will commence in 68 standard hours. Remained seated but could see the calculation in his posture. Admiral, may I ask about your people's history with the refugees? I believe. They are irrelevant to territorial claims. But not to honor. I've studied military records, Admiral. Your people have a proud tradition of protecting non-combatants in war zones. They are essentially refugees of war. Their world was destroyed by the Void Plague, not by military action, but the result is the same. His expression didn't change, but sensed a shift in the room's atmosphere. You suggest we have obligations to them. I suggest you have opportunities, replied. They are skilled miners and engineers. The asteroid field contains enough resources to support mining operations for decades. Instead of fighting the Helios Republic over territorial rights, what if both consortiums benefited from expertise? Explain. Gestured to, who activated a portable holographic projector. The display showed detailed analyses of the asteroid field's composition and potential yields, far more comprehensive than anything the competing consortiums had compiled. They have been studying these asteroids for months, explained. They've identified resource concentrations and optimal extraction techniques that could increase yields by 40% over conventional methods. Admiral studied the display with obvious interest. We're warriors, but they were also practical beings who understood the value of resources and efficiency. Furthermore, continued, they are desperate for stable employment and a permanent base of operations. They would be ideal partners for a long-term mining venture, skilled, motivated, and completely dependent on maintaining good relationships with their employers. And the Helios Republic? The Admiral asked. They have the most advanced refining and processing technology in this sector, interjected, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Combine extraction techniques, transportation and security capabilities, and Helios processing efficiency, and you have an operation that could dominate the regional market. Watched the Admiral's face carefully, reading the subtle changes in expression that indicated deep thought. Were aggressive, but they were also intelligent. The possibility of profit through cooperation rather than conquest was clearly appealing. This alliance you propose, said slowly, it would require trust between traditional enemies. Trust that would be guaranteed by neutral mediators, replied. Human pathfinders have successfully overseen similar partnerships in 17 different systems, and if additional security guarantees were needed, I believe the government would be willing to provide peacekeeping forces. The Admiral's gaze shifted to, you speak for your government. I speak for my pack, replied carefully. But my pack has the ear of the High Command. If this partnership proves successful, it could serve as a model for future cooperation throughout the sector. The meeting continued for 3 hours, with carefully guiding the discussion through technical details, profit projections, and security arrangements. By the end, Admiral had agreed to delay military action for another week, while representatives from all parties met to negotiate a formal agreement. More importantly, he had agreed to allow a human mediator to coordinate the discussions, a significant concession for a species that traditionally preferred to handle conflicts through direct confrontation. You argue well, human, the Admiral said as they prepared to leave. But words are simple. Implementation is the true test of any plan. Agreed, replied. That's why we'll need monitors and guarantors for any agreement, people who can ensure that all parties honor their commitments. And you believe your allies would serve in this role. Stepped forward. Admiral, my people have a saying, the pack that hunts together feeds together. If this partnership succeeds, we all benefit. If it fails because someone breaks faith, the response will be comprehensive. It wasn't exactly a threat, but it wasn't entirely diplomatic either. The Admiral's scaled lips curved into what might have been a smile. I think I like, he said. The negotiations over the following 6 days were complex, involving not just the 3 main parties, but representatives from the Galactic Mining Guild, the Refugee Resettlement Council, and the Regional Trade Federation. Coordinated the discussions with skill that impressed even Elder, managing to keep everyone focused on practical solutions rather than historical grievances. Final agreement was unprecedented in its scope. The Defense Force would provide security for the mining operations, while retaining majority ownership of the extracted resources. The Helios Republic would handle processing and marketing, taking a percentage of profits in exchange for their technological expertise. They would perform the actual extraction work, earning wages plus a resettlement fund that would eventually allow them to purchase their own mining equipment and establish permanent homes. Human Pathfinders would oversee implementation for the first 2 years, ensuring that all parties honored their commitments. And peacekeepers would be stationed in the system as a guarantee against anyone attempting to use force to change the terms of the agreement. But the most significant aspect of the agreement wasn't written in any legal document. It was the precedent it established. 3 species that had been on the verge of war had instead chosen cooperation, mediated by humans and guaranteed by. Standing in the observation lounge of the Wanderer, as the various fleets began their coordinated departure from the system, reflected on how much had changed since that day on Prime. Her cubs played nearby with a collection of toys and learning devices that represented technology from half a dozen different species. They were growing up in a galaxy where cooperation was possible, where different peoples could work together for mutual benefit. It worked better than I expected, admitted, joining her at the viewport. There were moments when I thought Admiral was going to revert to the traditional solution. What changed his mind? The same thing that convinced the others, the realization that this approach could make everyone more successful than they could be alone. Humans didn't invent cooperation, but we seemed to have a talent for helping others see its benefits. Nodded, understanding more than probably realized. She had watched him work throughout the negotiations, seeing how he guided discussions without dominating them, how he made space for others to contribute while keeping everyone focused on common goals. It was a form of leadership she had never encountered before, one based on service rather than authority. The cubs want to stay with you, she said quietly. They've asked if they can join the crew of the Wanderer permanently. Looked surprised. They're very young to be making such decisions. In culture, cubs begin choosing their paths early. They're drawn to exploration and mediation now, probably because of their experiences with your people, and I have been discussing whether to allow it. And we've decided that the best way to honor the debt we owe is to ensure that the next generation understands what humans have to offer the galaxy. If Kex and grow up working with Pathfinders, they'll carry that knowledge back to our people. Was quiet for a long moment. It would mean a very different life than they would have on a world. But not a lesser life. Different experiences, different challenges, but the same core values. Protection of innocence, service to others, the strength that comes from diversity. That evening, as their ship prepared for the journey back to human space, found herself in the ship's small communication center, preparing a report for her superiors. The message would formally recommend that the government enter into a partnership agreement with the Human Pathfinder program, sharing resources and expertise to address conflicts throughout their region of the galaxy. It would also recommend that selected families be allowed to send their cubs to grow up among humans, learning mediation and diplomacy skills that could serve both species in the years ahead. But most importantly, it would carry news of the debt that had been repaid in full, had saved her cubs' lives on a frozen world, and in return, her pack had helped him save thousands of lives in the Sigma Draconis system. The circle was complete, the honor satisfied. As she composed her final thoughts, became aware of voices from the ship's common area. The cubs were teaching a lullaby, their young voices blending with his deeper tones in a harmony that would have been impossible just a year ago. Elder appeared in the doorway of the communication center. "Commander, the message pods are ready for transmission." "In a moment," replied, listening to the music drifting through the ship. "It's remarkable how quickly they adapted," the Elder observed. "Both species learning to work together as if it were the most natural thing in the galaxy." "Maybe it is natural," suggested. "Maybe we've been making it more complicated than it needs to be." 6 months later, stood in the formal gardens of the High Command, watching as her cubs played with a group of young humans who had come to establish the first permanent cultural exchange program between their species. The children were teaching each other games, sharing stories, and learning words in each other's languages with the effortless enthusiasm that only the young could maintain. The partnership between and humans had exceeded everyone's expectations. Joint missions had successfully resolved conflicts in 12 different systems, and the cooperation model pioneered in Sigma Draconis had been adopted by 3 other multi-species alliances. But beyond the political and military successes, something more profound had emerged. The 2 species had discovered that their fundamental values, protection of family, service to community, exploration of the unknown, aligned in ways that made them natural partners. Had returned to Earth briefly to receive commendation for his work, but he had specifically requested assignment to the joint human missions that were now being planned throughout the sector. He had found in his people the family structure and loyalty bonds that complemented human flexibility and adaptability. Standing in the garden, watching the children play together, thought about the avalanche that had nearly taken her cubs' lives. At the time, it had seemed like the worst possible disaster, a catastrophe that would destroy everything she valued. Instead, it had become the first step in a journey that had led her family, her pack, and her entire species into a larger community than they had ever imagined possible. Kex came running up to her, his friend close behind, both of them chattering excitedly about a new game they had invented that combined elements from both cultures. "Mom," he said, reverting to the simple language of childhood, "can come to our next family gathering. I want him to meet grandfather and learn about the old stories." Smiled, remembering her own grandfather's tales of ancient hunts and legendary pack leaders. Soon there would be new stories to tell, tales of humans and working together, of children who grew up speaking multiple languages and thinking beyond the boundaries of single worlds. "I think," she told her cub, "that would be honored to join our family gathering. After all, he's part of our pack now." As the sun set over the capital, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, reflected on the debt that had been repaid and the friendships that had grown from tragedy. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, other species were learning to work together, guided by human mediators and protected by peacekeepers. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and opportunities that no single species could face alone. But together, with the bonds of trust forged in crisis and strengthened through shared service, there was no limit to what they might accomplish. The pack had been reborn, expanded beyond the boundaries of species, and to include all those who shared their values. And at the heart of that extended family, 2 young cubs played with their human friends, already planning the adventures they would share among the stars.